Hello, this is David, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. Today I'm speaking with George Salis about Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. Now, before we get into discussion on the novel, a little background about George if you don't know who he is. He is the author of the novel Sea Above, Sun Below, which was praised by both Alexander Thoreau and Ricky Ducournay. And it's a really good book. I've read it myself. I highly recommend it. It touches on a lot of the same themes that we get into with the Satanic Verses, which, if you're listening to this, you probably have read it sometime in the past. Outside of its infamy and its causing of a sort of cultural storm, it's an incredibly well-written, beautiful novel. And I hope that our conversation, as convoluted as it might be at times, brings a little bit of insight into the book and gives you some idea of who George is and his writing. So without further ado, enjoy the episode. So, George, how did you find this book, or how did this book find you?
That's a great question, and I actually came to it via, let's say, an unusual way, although not unheard of. I was reading Christopher Hitchens' memoir, Hitch 22, and this was before I was anywhere near knee-deep or neck-deep into fiction, and he has a chapter on Rushdie. It's only 20 pages, but it's a beautiful encapsulation of the so-called Rushdie affair, and he was one of the big defenders of Rushdie and free speech in general, and that's actually how I first heard about the Satanic Verses. And from there, it was me first reading The Ground Beneath Her Feet, then the Satanic Verses. I finally felt ready to read that, and it was a love affair ever since.
Oh, interesting. You found him through Hitch, which I was just rereading Hitchens on Rushdie. Maybe it's from his memoir, but I think it was first published as an article.
Yes.
But a very strong defense of Rushdie and the freedom to offend, which this book most certainly did to quite a few people. How familiar are you with the sort of background of the novel and the history of its publication and the history of, I guess, what the title means and everything else?
I'm very familiar. I knew about the controversy before reading the book, and if you're coming to the verses for the controversy only, then you're coming at it the wrong way. But at the same time, it's definitely not something you should ignore. And that's because the metaphors, the themes in the book sort of break out of the book and are mirrored in the Rushdie affair. Although I'm self-conscious of saying Rushdie affair when it should be the Khomeini affair, considering he started that whole mess. And whereas everyone tried to blame the writer for creating a work of art, and as if it was his fault, which is the worst thing you could possibly say, in my opinion. And so, when you're coming to the Satanic Verses without knowing anything about it, and you see the title that has the word Satan in it, well, my mother-in-law, when she saw it, she said, "Oh, that sounds like a scary book." And the thing is, in my opinion, Satan is something of an underdog character in the mythology. And that actually reflects the characters in the book, Saladin and Gibreel. All three of them had their falls.
That's right, yeah, and I think through the narrator, who, though unnamed, certainly hints at being the fallen one himself, Satan. There's this similarity that's sort of pushed by the narrative, by the characterizations of these connections between this sort of perception of Satan and the perception of certain aspects of the characters.
Absolutely. And this is what I love about the Satanic Verses and Rushdie's work in general, is that he, at the height of his powers, he wrote everything books with a capital E, a genre that sort of falls under maximalism. And so there's not just one character or two characters. There's not just one story or two stories, or say a nice linear point A to point B story that is tied with a bow at the end. He tries to encapsulate a cosmos, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think you see that definitely in this work. Even though there's sort of two central characters that that drive the narrative, along the way you get a lot of history, you get a lot of references and allusions to myth, to religion, to pop culture of the East and the West, and to religions of East and the West, and to literature of the East and the West, and to film of the East and the West. And he does all of this in such a very fun way, even though the things that are happening in the book are rather serious and oftentimes dark. And maybe it's because the narrator is this sort of is Satan. There's a sense of humor to everything.
Absolutely. And you mention all the allusions and the myths that are in the book, and that's because Rushdie is extremely well-read, extremely intelligent, not to boost his ego, but it's true. And people say, oh, he knew what he was doing, as if it was a bad thing. He did know what he was doing. He was creating an amazing work of art. And if someone didn't know what they were doing for 6-7 years, however long it took to write the verses, and think it would be a failure, I think they might have something wrong with them if they didn't know what they were doing.
Yeah. So you brought up the fact that some people say he didn't know what he was doing. I've seen that as a sort of defense against the calls for banning, burning, and the fatwa itself, that Rushdie didn't set out to be blasphemous.
Here's the thing. Well, people said that he did know what he was doing, to condemn him. And the thing is, there's no way around the blasphemy, because at least a huge thread in this novel is the tug and pull of the Quran, which is considered an absolute book, an absolute word from God that has no reiterations, no remixes. And then the other side of that, we have the prophet-like character Gibreel, who is connected to these various characters and hearing a medley of voices, and they interlink and they overlap like palimpsests. And this is part of what Rushdie is mining as far as his work of art. And the verses, he took this strange historical fact that Muhammad first included 3 pagan gods, and he did this to suit his needs, his political needs. And afterward, when it didn't suit his needs anymore, he declared that these verses were actually not part of the Quran at all, and that they were whispered to him by the trickery of Satan. And this is what he mines as far as a huge theme in the book. The verses that stick in our head, we don't know their origin, all the voices and urges within us that compel us to act, which could be from Satan, the angel that fell, or from Allah, the God who rules with an iron fist, or it can be just the human condition, because a personality is definitely not a static thing.
That's interesting, yeah. Mahound, as Rushdie calls him, which is one of the, I think, the charges of offense that many believers find in this novel, because the title given to the prophet Muhammad is rather derogatory in historical nature.
Yes, and people forget. They forget, or maybe they didn't read it at all, the fact that this name is explained in the book. To turn insults into strengths, Whigs, Tories, blacks all chose to wear with pride the names they were given in scorn. And that enough should be a satisfying explanation for why he used the name.
And that quote continues with, I think, some really, what is to me really representative of this sort of writing style, where it continues, likewise our mountain-climbing, profit-motivated solitary is to be the medieval baby frightener, the devil's synonym, Mahound.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was such a cool little passage. But when you were talking about how it's sort of this play on these voices, right? And I think you see that in, like, you were calling him Gabriel. In my head, it was Gibreel with a kind of harder sound, but I actually don't know how to pronounce it.
I don't take authority on this either. But he's intimately connected with Gabriel as we know him in the West.
Yeah, yeah. And as his mother calls him, the angel, and he sort of is later diagnosed with schizophrenia, and so these dreams, these voices in his head, the visions of the ghost of his ex-lover, all of these things can be seen as either part of the sort of magic realist nature of the novel or a sort of reasoning through this disease that he's suffering from.
And it's both, because often people hear the word magical or magic realism and they focus on the magic bit and forget about the realism. They think maybe it's a synonym for fantasy. But fantasy is escapism, whereas magical realism, it's the heightening of realism through metaphors made flesh.
Yeah. There's a really good passage where Chamcha has sort of metamorphs into this goat-like creature. And it says, what puzzled Chamcha was that a circumstance which struck him as utterly bewildering and unprecedented, that is, his metamorphosis into this supernatural imp, was being treated by the others as if it were the most banal and familiar matter they could imagine. This isn't England, he thought, not for the first or last time. How could it be, after all, where in all that moderate and commonsensical land was there room for such a police van, in whose interior such events as these might plausibly transpire? That metamorphosis and this event inside the van are two ways in which I think Rushdie uses the magic realism to focus, to make what I think is the larger focus of this novel, which is on the sort of migrant experience and the idea of wanting to become something or be a part of something.
He literally becomes the scapegoat.
Yeah.
And this isn't the real world through magic, the real world explanation, or at least the depiction of the xenophobic atmosphere at that time in London, in which Margaret Thatcher at least shared this aspect with Trump, which is to demonize immigrants who were coming and to use them as a scapegoat for all the problems that were plaguing them at the time. And so we get that heightened version in the book itself using magical realism. And I think it's worth noting how influenced Salman Rushdie was by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And he wrote a beautiful piece on Marquez at the time of his death, saying how even before visiting any Latin American country, reading the works of Marquez, he saw so many similarities to his own world, including the mullahs. His mullahs were Gabo's bishops. His bazaars were Gabo's street markets. His whole world, Rushdie's whole world, was translated into Spanish. And of course, they shared a lot of common themes as far as the adversity, the fight between the artful and the ironic mind versus the literal-minded and the barbarous. And this is aside from, say, the Arabian Nights, which you can see throughout the Satanic Verses and his other greater works like Midnight's Children.
But I'm curious, what is it about the book itself? Because I know, at least from one of your Instagram posts, you seem to have quite a number of copies of the book. So I'm assuming you've read it, I don't know, at least twice, maybe?
I'm ashamed to admit I've only read it once, but
oh, okay.
I keep a copy on my desk, one of several copies, as you mentioned, and I'll open it and I'll reread passages whenever I feel like it. And over the years, I think it's encoded into my DNA. It's in my heart. It's in my soul. It's in my mind. And it has influenced my work on sort of a quantum level, because influence is always hard to gauge, at least most influence. There are some influences that are fairly obvious. But after I wrote the beginning of my novel, I realized, well, my character is falling out of the sky, just as his two protagonists are falling out of the sky. And I only just remembered, or maybe just realized, that the two-pronged ending of my novel, in which there are conflicting eyewitnesses to a large event, is echoed at the ending of the beautiful Ayesha storyline in the Satanic Verses, in which Ayesha, this prophet who wears a dress of butterflies, comes to the Arabian Sea where she's leading people to Mecca, and they must cross the sea, and it's this example of faith without evidence or despite evidence. And there's a two-pronged ending there. You see all the people diving into the sea and drowning, but then later when the police are trying to figure out what is going on here, and a few people who survived, they get their eyewitness accounts of what happened. And while they were half drowning under the sea, they saw Ayesha and her true followers going across the Arabian Sea, having been parted like Moses' Red Sea. And did you think it was quite clear that what actually happened, or was it more ambiguous in your opinion?
I mean, given the nature of the book's general critique of this sort of fantastical thinking, even though the book is filled with fantastical things, it was hard for me not to read it as a rather straightforward account of people dying and drowning, and others sort of projecting this still clinging sense of hope and belief. But that could also be my own sort of rather staunch agnosticism.
It sort of depends on what you bring to the table, but at the same time, a literal, highly faithful person, would they even get to this point in the book if they're reading it at all? I'm not sure. But you make a good point about the difference between sheer fantasy and then the fantasy that Rushdie employs to heighten reality. And when I went to an event in Miami to see Rushdie promote one of his books for the first time, he said that just like writing about the future is a way of talking about the past, fairy tales are a way of talking about the real world. And these are fairy tales that actually have some substance, not the fairy tales in the Quran that dictate what sexual positions you're allowed to be in, or dictate what you're allowed to have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, etc.
I found that one of the reasons why I feel like this novel is so good is because Rushdie has a way of dividing his narrative techniques in a way that they're not so different, they're not so contrasting, but there's a subtle enough difference that, like when you go from following Gibreel or following Chamcha or going into the sort of dream state of Gibreel, there's a slight narrative difference in how he tells the story that kind of keeps me going. And I found that, like, I think the history of the novel is interesting and important even today. Like, it still has relevance. I know in 2016, some Iranian news media pitched in an extra, like, whatever, $500,000 on the fatwa. So, like, the fatwa's still going on. The history's still there. I think Rushdie himself said that this novel probably wouldn't be published in today's overly censorious culture.
Yes.
But even outside of that, the narrative itself, the way he writes, is so good. Like, it's such a good book.
That's the thing that's sort of heartbreaking, is that for the longest time, the book did not get to live the normal life of a book, like Midnight's Children, which won the Booker and won the Booker of the Bookers. And Martin Amis, the writer Martin Amis, who is friends with Rushdie, during that time of the Khomeini affair, he said Rushdie had vanished into the front page. What he meant by that was all that was being written about Rushdie and his work had to do with the controversy, not the beautiful accomplishment that the novel is. And only in the last couple of decades or so now can the book live a normal life. But as you said, the fight is not over and never will be over. The bounty was actually raised by another $600,000 in 2016,
okay.
which is insane.
Yeah.
And he did say that we live in a climate of fear and nervousness. I don't know how long this has been going on, but for quite some time. And it's doubtful if the Satanic Verses would be able to find a publisher, like he said. And even, let's not forget that the only way to get rid of a fatwa is if the person who made it rescinds it. Khomeini has since died. And so now the fatwa is essentially supreme law and sort of speaks to the fact that Iran is like a necrocracy. Like North Korea, Kim Jong-il is the supreme leader forever and ever. Unto death never do us part. Rant over.
What I wanted to kind of get at, which we've sort of bifurcated and gone off on our own little paths into digressions, is what about the book? What about the story? What about the writing? Why is it a book that you dip into from time to time? Why is it on your desk? Because I remember when I read your novel, which is great, by the way.
Thank you.
I remember seeing these connections to this novel. Of course, I think the opening scene really does that. But then there's some other things that sort of, I think, make that connection to sort of drawing on myth, drawing on religion, drawing on that, something we haven't talked about yet, which is this idea of being sort of chained to your past in some way.
This conversation we're having is just one more indication of why I love the book. We're having a sort of labyrinthine conversation, and his work is labyrinthine, and I love it for two reasons. One, it is undeniably this item, this milestone in history in which a culture war was started, or more accurately, a war against culture, which will continue to be fought until the end of time. And aside from all that, the prose exhibits what John Barth calls passionate virtuosity. I was reading sections and just swooning at the alliteration, the imagery. Rushdie has it going on. Let's just say that.
Is there a particular passage or anything you might have that you think is sort of a good representation of this style?
To read?
Yeah.
If you can give me a moment, I can try to find.
Of course. This is something we've noted many times, we being Nick, Nathan, and I who kind of run this podcast, is that if we quote from a book a lot, it usually means we like it. So there are times where we go into an episode thinking, this book's not that great. And then we end up quoting from it endlessly. Like, all right, maybe we're wrong because I just want to keep quoting passages. I have so many passages just highlighted just because of the sound and the way his sentences are structured and the playfulness of the voice and the propulsiveness of the narrative. I find it oddly charming.
And it's alive. His sentences breathe.
Yeah.
There's a musicality to it that can't be denied. And it's this kind of writing that is often disparaged or frowned upon, especially in the sort of stultifying atmosphere of fiction workshop, for example. But Rushdie is his own, and he cannot be contained. I'm currently looking for a passage here. How did you feel rereading it after, 20 years?
Yeah, so my father owned a copy of this book, and I tried to read it when I was 13, 14, and I just couldn't get into it. I had no idea what was going on, and I gave up pretty quickly. But then when I was at university, I had a professor, Gary Edelman, rest in peace, probably the greatest professor I've ever had in my entire life. And he was, at the time, he was a much older man, near retirement, and he suffered from blindness. And so one impressive thing about this man was that he could quote passages from Beckett and Kafka and Malcolm Lowry and Salman Rushdie just from memory, from pure memory.
Are you sure he wasn't Jorge Luis Borges?
He wasn't, but he was a great teacher, and I think one of the few old school teachers and professors that just had a love for literature itself and not so much theory, which is why he was my favorite, and I took every class I could with him. He made me fall in love with Beckett and Kafka and T.S. Eliot and just so many great writers. And he assigned us this novel. The course was structured around the idea of the postmodern idea of sort of challenging grand narratives. And it was just such an eye-opening experience to read this.
So I have a passage if you want me to read it now, or...
Yeah.
This is near the beginning, because right off the beginning, the story is amazing. And so, the aircraft cracked in half, a seed pod giving up its spores, an egg yielding its mystery. Two actors prancing, Gibreel and buttonny-pursed Mr. Saladin Chamcha, fell like tidbits of tobacco from a broken old cigar. Above, behind, below them in the void there hung reclining seats, stereophonic headsets, drinks, trolleys, motion discomfort receptacles, disembarkation cards, duty-free video games, braided caps, paper cups, blankets, oxygen masks. Also, for there had been more than a few migrants aboard, yes, quite a quantity of wives who had been grilled by reasonable, doing-their-job officials about the length of and distinguishing moles upon their husbands' genitalia, a sufficiency of children upon whose legitimacy the British government had cast its ever-reasonable doubts. Mingling with the remnants of the plane, equally fragmented, equally absurd, there floated the debris of the soul, broken memories, sloughed-off selves, severed mother tongues, violated privacies, untranslatable jokes, extinguished futures, lost loves, the forgotten meaning of hollow, booming words, land, belonging, home. Knocked a little silly by the blast, Gibreel and Saladin plummeted like bundles dropped by some carelessly open-beaked stork. And because Chamcha was going down headfirst in the recommended position for babies entering the birth canal, he commenced to feel a low irritation at the other's refusal to fall in plain fashion. Beautiful stuff. It doesn't take much to remind me how much I love this novel. And notice also the lists of things falling out of the plane, and not just the physical things, but the metaphysical things. And this is indicative of everything books, maximalism. You won't find the usual Raymond Carver-inspired author using lists in such a Calvino-esque way, for example.
First of all, the opening of this book is so magnificent. It's really a wonderful and wild and almost confusing experience in the beginning.
Yes, especially if you don't know what to expect. What are these people doing falling out of the sky, cast out?
Yeah.
Zooming out a bit, you mentioned the differences between the stories, the side-by-side interlaced stories. But if we zoom out a bit, maybe we can talk about what kind of storyteller Rushdie is. Because I think he's also well ingrained into modern storytelling, but also postmodern, because we get these somewhat subtle, not so subtle moments of the author-God presence, which is indicative of postmodernism. And you said maybe this narrator, this presence is Satan himself, but I also got the indication that it could be the other side of the coin, our bearded friend, God. But at the same time, there's only one person pulling the strings, and that's Rushdie himself. And there is a passage where the fabric of this story is sort of opening up. And it says, higher powers had taken an interest. It should have been obvious to them both, and such powers, I am of course speaking of myself, have a mischievous, almost a wanton attitude to tumbling flies. And the funny thing, I don't know if it's ironic, but the funny thing about postmodernism is that it's pre-modern, we get this kind of consciousness of the text, this metafictionality in Tristram Shandy or Don Quixote, which some people like to consider as the first novel ever written, although that's not quite true. What do you think about Rushdie as a storyteller in a traditional way or a non-traditional way?
I think he's, at least in this novel in particular, he certainly has a lot of the elements of postmodernism are there. The playfulness in narrative, a certain awareness of the narrative itself and how narratives function, the writing of, and sort of the winking at the reader, and the constant references and allusions, as mentioned before, in addition to the maximalist style. Yet there is it's interesting. The postmodernism as a word and as idea is so convoluted and confused, especially when you relate it to other things that call itself postmodern, whether it's art or philosophy. Because I think one thing that separates postmodern literature from other postmodern works of art is writers tend to be a lot more judgmental. Unlike postmodern thinkers, there's still a sense of connection to the past and a certain belief in first principles and some sort of sense of truth, even though the idea of truth is very slippery.
This applies to people who don't prescribe to postmodernism? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. So generally, or at least in terms of as a sort of philosophy, postmodernism tends to go behind the sort of Nietzschean idea that there is no truth, only interpretation. I think Rushdie, especially in the Satanic Verses, plays with that idea, especially in his critique of the foundations of the religion and how the messenger receives the message, or rather produces the message himself. But there's still a sense of not necessarily, I guess, of truth or of critique. And it's hard to critique something without having a sort of baseline of what you believe to be morally right in some way.
Let's not forget the storyline with Mahound, in which Baal the poet, was it Baal who was transcribing these verses?
Actually, it was Salman.
Salman, oh, even better.
Yeah.
Salman
exactly.
was transcribing these verses, and the doubter that he was, a healthy dosage of doubt, he wanted to perform I guess we could say, a scientific test and add his little own flourishes to these verses to see if Mahound would notice. Because if this word is absolute, like it's supposed to be, then he would notice. And of course, at first or quite a while, suspicious while, he does not notice. I don't think Rushdie would profess anything that would be approaching absolute truth, unless that absolute truth is that there is no absolute truth, which is, I think, a kind of paradox that he would celebrate and does celebrate. And there's an interesting quote, if I can find it. Oh, I have it here. This is Mahound speaking. All around him he thinks, as he half dreams, half wakes, are people hearing voices, being seduced by words, but not his, never his original material. Then whose? Who is whispering in their ears, enabling them to move mountains, halt clocks, diagnose disease? And this encapsulates all the soup, the medley of voices that you find interwoven throughout the whole novel, and especially, of course, Farishta's ostensible schizophrenia. What was the point of this? I've lost our main thesis here.
We got lost in truth and untruth.
Oh, okay. Were you saying that there was an absolute truth that Rushdie was professing?
Well, I think this is the tricky part of a writer, especially one who, like in interviews and stuff, especially when it relates to this novel and his arguments with religion, he is not a moral relativist. And if you are not a moral relativist, that means you must believe in some kind of truth. because you believe that there's a right and a wrong. And I'm not speaking about anything necessarily religious. This could be entirely secular. But because I think great works of fiction don't necessarily have to say this is true or this is not true. This is because fiction at its best challenges and interrogates and plays with these ideas and makes the reader sort of do a lot of the work, or at least the good ones do.
I couldn't agree more. I think the best writers, the best books don't have the answers, or if they do, it's not because the author had the answers, but that there's something there to mine on a subconscious level if the reader's willing to do the work. And yes, I would agree that freedom of speech is, if anything, an absolute truth. One of the things worth fighting for. And going back to morality in general, I don't know. I mean, Rushdie, I think, would say that, yes, there are rights and wrongs that apply universally, but not that there's a set of 10 commandments that must be followed with no questioning at all. The difference between him and Khomeini is he incites discussion between all people, voices, the multiplicity of voices. As he says, and this is from the book, as he writes, language is courage, the ability to conceive a thought, to speak it, and by doing so, to make it true. And I might as well go on to my next favorite quote. That this is actually one that I used when I was inducted into the English honors program at my university. A poet's work is to name the innameable, to point at frauds, to take sides, start arguments, shape the world, and stop it from going to sleep. People would say, well, that's a tall order, or maybe you're elevating fiction beyond what it's even capable of doing. Yet, the book lived this life. It started arguments. People took sides and pointed at frauds, etc. So I don't think it's some highfalutin ideal that we should totally forget about or set aside. What do you think? Is it capable? Should it be capable of stopping the world from going to sleep? Should it be capable? Or should novels simply be this thing that exists, entertainment, something that you read sort of in your own echo chamber and doesn't really move mountains or diagnose disease, as earlier put? Yeah.
Should they? I think a novel should be whatever it is, and some of them will be entertainment, and some of them will try to change the world, and most of those will probably fail at doing so. I think this book, this novel in particular, I think no doubt had a great effect on the world. Probably one of the last pieces of fiction, certainly the only piece of fiction in my lifetime that I can think of that has altered the landscape in some way. And I know, based on like reading a little bit about its background and its effect, really influenced and gave voice to a lot of people, especially in India and in Pakistan and in that region, to explore some of these ideas and some of these thoughts, and to challenge power, to challenge authority. And yeah, it's an incredible piece of literature. And I think, at least for me, literature that I am most interested should challenge its reader in some way.
Yes, that's not as tall of an order as the quote I read.
Yeah.
And I don't have the answer for this, but yeah, I agree that on some level, whether minuscule or mountainous, the reader should be challenged in some way. And you made a great point that this book is written for, at least part of it was written for the Indians, the Pakistanis, and yet the book is still banned in, I think it was 23 countries. It's still banned in India, Saudi Arabia, in 21 countries. It's been banned for 30 years and continues to be banned on religious grounds.
Yeah, it's wild. I think it's written for everybody, but I think maybe especially we kind of touched on it, the immigrant experience, the sort of cultural connection between between Indians and Pakistanis and England in particular. The book does so much with that relationship, and that, I don't know if relationship's the right word, but
that provocation. And yes, even more than the average reader, people who can relate to this on their personal experience on that level, they'll probably get even more out of the book than the average reader.
Yeah. Kind of related to the idea of the immigrant experiences, the idea of change and the idea of reincarnation. Let me read a passage.
Sure.
Reincarnation, for frenzied Gibreel, was a term beneath whose shield many notions gathered a babbling. Phoenix from ashes, the resurrection of Christ, the transmigration, at the instant of death, of the soul of the Dalai Lama into the body of a newborn child. Such matters got mixed up with the avatars of Vishnu, the metamorphosis of Jupiter, who had imitated Vishnu by adopting the form of a bull, and so on, including, of course, the progress of human beings through successive cycles of life, now as cockroaches, now as kings, towards the bliss of no more returns. To be born again, first you have to die. Chamcha did not bother to protest that in most of the examples Gibreel provided in his soliloquies, metamorphosis had not required a death. The new flesh had been entered into through other gates.
I mean, he's inspired, once again, not just by the Arabian Nights, but Ovid's Metamorphosis, and Borges. I remember reading in the back of the book that he cites the Book of Imaginary Beings by Borges, because that's what he used to describe the manticore that appears later on. And yes, we get these fantastical creatures or people transforming into fantastical creatures, such as Khomeini, who fights the goddess Desh. She transforms into this winged beast, and they both fight in the sky. And I think this speaks to not just the immigrant experience where you have to adapt to this new climate and become Americanized or Britishized, but also just the day-to-day feeling that each moment you live in is a moment that's already gone. Each moment is a death.
That's that old Heraclitus river you can't walk into twice.
Absolutely. And I think, at least partly, this is what Rushdie is exploring with all these transformations.
And I think this is what makes this book relatable to anyone who wants to read it, and why his references sort of span from Christendom to Buddhism to ancient and mythical ideas, is that across all of these cultures, it is incredibly human to want to be something that you are not. And we see that especially in Chamcha. His sort of disdain for his home country and this desire to be British, this other sort of fantasized version of what it means to be an Englishman.
He demonizes his homeland.
Oh, yeah.
And he becomes sort of the racist, if you will, by demonizing people who are not in the same socioeconomic class as he is. And then he later realizes that he cannot get rid of his past, and he goes home and he visits his dying father. And this is probably one of the most emotional parts in the book, and it was one of the first times that a book had ever caused me to cry. I won't deny it.
The reunion, yeah, it's...
The reunion with his dying father, yes.
I think it's a tough one, especially for anyone who's had a rough relationship with one of their parents.
And who hasn't at this point, right?
Yeah, honestly. But yeah, this idea of transformation, it runs throughout the book constantly. And
even if one does not become transformed into the ideal that they had originally had in mind, they still get transformed, whether for better or for worse, through all the experiences that these protagonists endure.
Yeah. I can't remember where it was, but somewhere near the middle of the book, when when Chamcha's transformation when he finally returns back to being a human, there's a lot of interesting ways to read how he sort of internalized the perception of himself as a foreigner, as this otherly creature, which is, he was trying to maintain his sort of Britishness, so he just bought into this and accepted this version of himself as this monster, this creature. And it's not until he allows his hate to really burn through that view that he returns to his more natural human form.
His hate was the antidote? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, maybe at first that sounds a bit Sith Lord-esque, but Rushdie, and as you were alluding to earlier, he celebrates multiculturalism, multilingualism. He celebrates the diversity that life has to offer, and of course, the full range of human expression, from hatred to love. Of course, with an emphasis on love, I would say, especially after what occurred with the book's publication. Is that what you gleaned of this hateful antidote, or no? Yeah,
that, and I was just thinking, to me, it's a very funny a funny way to sort of view something that might be considered negative, where and I think it can be, but I think Rushdie is poking fun at people in general, and that hate often is such a human thing to experience.
Absolutely.
That it sort of returns him to himself, or sort of makes him aware of reality, that sometimes you need that hate, that fuel, to sort of burn through the bullshit. And I just found it incredibly humorous, and it's just one little thing out of a book that I find, like I said in the beginning, even though it's quite serious and deals with these heavy themes, it's still a funny novel, a very satirical novel.
Rushdie finds the humor in paradox always, or in expectations subverted. Another thing was when Ball goes into hiding and he joins the brothel. Mm-hmm. And how does he undermine the Islam, or submission as it's referred to? He encourages the prostitutes to take the identities of Mahoom's 12 wives. And of course, what's funny is that this is a very out there marketing gimmick, and yet it works, and probably would work in real life too if it hasn't already been tried. Who knows? Because it plays on that concept of forbidden fruit. And there's sort of a Rabelaisian veneer to his humor, because it's so out there and hysteric, if not hysterical. And I remember in Midnight's Children, to get rid of the assassins that were coming for one of the characters, someone else let out a very sharp whistle, and it was such a sharp whistle that it caused the assassins to get huge scimitar-like erections. And that, no pun intended, stuck out to me as far as the humor that Rushdie is capable of. The other expectation that's subverted and is humorous is the fact that we have two people falling, and whereas you would expect them, or at least one of them, to scream, we have them singing.
Yeah.
And that's what you get throughout the whole novel, these unexpected moments that can be simultaneously humorous, wondrous, and just a multiplicity of feelings.
It's hard to talk about the humor of the book, because I think the comedy is very... It's more clever than it is laugh out loud humor. I mean,
yeah.
And there's like some kind of humor, but it's more about the cleverness of the narrative, the sort of in-jokes to references, and generally when the narrator, who I'm still convinced is Satan for a few reasons. I'm curious why you think it might be God, but
well, you read the book most recently, so you can tell me.
Okay,
but my first impression was not God really in the strict sense of, say, the Abrahamic tyrant, but God in the sense of the creator of this cosmos bounded in a book. And it could be Salman Rushdie himself, or who knows how many layers, how many turtles upon turtles we have.
Yeah.
As far as humor, though, humor is a fickle thing. You know, you have the laugh out loud, you have the noise through nose, as you said, more of a clever thing that doesn't really produce the horseshoe row of teeth being exposed. I don't often laugh out loud when I'm reading books. I think the closest to that would be Alexander Theroux, how he roasts people like Dave Chappelle, his characters. But no, I don't often laugh out loud, even if it is Rushdie with his craziness.
Yeah. I think I'm with you on that. I honestly don't think I've laughed out loud from reading a book.
Is something wrong with us?
Yeah, maybe.
If you trust all these hyperbolic blurbs that authors or critics leave, I laughed till I pissed myself.
Yeah.
Have you read Midnight's Children?
About 20 years ago, right after I read Satanic Verses, but I haven't reread it since, so my familiarity is little to none, I would say at this point.
Mine is a little hazy, but I do think Midnight's Children and the Satanic Verses are his twin pillar masterpieces. It really is hard to choose between one or the other. But I think one fairly large difference is that the protagonist in Midnight's Children experiences a Bildungsroman type of story, as discursive and wild as it is. Whereas the Satanic Verses, we have two protagonists who are already grown physically, at least, and they experience a maturation on the mental level, if you will. Whereas Midnight Children is a Bildungsroman. In the Satanic Verses, we have one of Rushdie's most personal stories, because he shares so much with his character, Saladin. They were both born in Bombay. They were both humiliated as schoolboys in England, and were married to British women. And of course, there's always that tug and pull of East and West that is throughout almost all of his work. He even has a story collection called East-West.
Let me ask you a question about maturation in the characters. I'm curious, in Saladin, in Chamcha, you get that sort of satisfying, if not depressing ending, but still somewhat hopeful. Whereas with Gibreel, I don't know what his, because throughout the novel, Chamcha is sort of, he's just getting the shaft left and right, essentially. Mm-hmm. And it sort of drives him to do something awful and to sort of set off a series of terrible events. And Gibreel does the same too, and is never, he's not as sympathetic through the novel, but he also doesn't experience much in terms of change, except for in the beginning when his sort of loss of faith sort of sets him on this path, which is interesting and might even be interpreted by a believer as sort of warning, right?
Yeah, they can pick and choose.
Yeah.
They're good at that.
But I'm curious, what, if anything, do you see as sort of his maturation,
I'm not sure, but it's possible that this is sort of Rushdie's way of having two endings. Two characters that are intimately connected and go on their divergent paths. One who, as you said, has a more happy ending, if we can call it that, and then one who dies. And he committed suicide, is that right?
Oh yeah, he rubbed the magic lamp and then blew his brains out.
There's your happy ending.
Yeah. Although, now that I'm thinking about it, there is, and this is something that also plays into the novel, this idea of forgiveness. Not necessarily redemption, but I think forgiveness. And Gibreel forgives Saladin, right? Near the end of the novel. And
you think that's an indication of growth?
Maybe. It's certainly, I mean, he's part of his psychosis is he doesn't know whether or not he is a prophet of doom or not, right? He refers to himself as there to judge humanity.
Well, suicide is one way to silence the voices once and for all, even though it's let's say, maybe a permanent solution to a temporary problem.
Yeah.
But I think that's a great point about forgiveness, which is the opposite of vengeance. If you have the ability to forgive even the worst person, then for better or for worse, you have grown beyond, let's say, the primal urges that govern us.
I like that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think we've touched on a lot of parts of this novel without breaking through everything, because there's so much there, as you mentioned. It's such a maximalist experience.
Experience is the key word, because there's novels you read and someone says, well, what's it about? And you can give them a nice little synopsis. But no, you cannot accurately answer what's it about when reading the Satanic Verses. It's about you reading it and experiencing it, and it has an almost ineffable quality to it. He plays with ambiguities galore, all the twists and turns of the human condition.
Well, thanks for coming on and talking about it. I think it was really good to hear your perspective, and I think for those of us that have read your book and enjoyed it, I think we'll see some of these connections.
Thanks so much for having me on, David. This is wonderful.
Thanks for listening. You can find out more information about George Salis. He's on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Goodreads. That's Salis, Salis. He also has a website, georgesalis.com. And George is also the editor of The Kaleidoscope, which is spelled Collidescope. Sort of an online literary review. It's really interesting. Check it out. He writes a column on invisible books there. There's also a Patreon for his Kaleidoscope, which I recommend you support. So find that at patreon.com/thekaleidoscope. And if you want to check us out, Books of Some Substance, we are on Twitter and Instagram at booksosubstance, or at our website, booksofsomesubstance.com, where you can find some books we've published, information about podcasts, artwork, and some really kick-ass merch. T-shirts, sweatshirts, hats, all that sort of stuff. Until next time, happy reading.
Yes. I mean, I didn't mention, but maybe should have mentioned the fact that it takes a lot of effort to be offended by reading a 600-page book when you can just close the book.